Hello and welcome. What a wonderful event. It's so great to see you all here this evening. My name is Sherry Ryan. I'm the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. It is such a great pleasure to host this event this evening. I'd like to extend my deepest thanks to Erwin and Rosalind Engelman for their generous support of the Lily and Nathan Ackerman lecture series on equality and justice. And I think they're online with us. Give a shout if you're online. Marianne, are your parents online?
Oh, I don't think so. They actually are stuck somewhere, but they will be joining us soon.
Oh, great. Well, please extend our thanks to them. This lecture series is named in honor of Rosalind's parents and is intended to shine light on major questions of equality and justice. I'd like to thank Marianne Engelman-Lado, who's here with us. You see her on the screen, who will be speaking this evening on behalf of the Engelman-Ackerman family, and will tell us more about this gift that supports this lecture series. Finally, I'd like to thank our wonderful Anna D'Souza, who's currently serving as the Ackerman chair, she said, at the Mark School, and she was successful in securing our amazing speaker. Hello. This evening, Olúfẹ Táíwò from Georgetown University. So I'll say a few words about Marianne Lado, who will be picking up after me. So she'll be speaking next. Her career as a lawyer and academic has been devoted to civil rights and environmental justice. After starting her career at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, she joined the faculty of the Mark School as a tenure-track faculty member. Since that time, her experience includes 10 years as general counsel of New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, which is a nonprofit civil rights law firm where she served as a senior staff attorney at Earth Justice. More recently, she was directing environmental and client justice clinics at Vermont Law School and at Yale when she was tapped to join the Biden administration. She currently serves there as Deputy General Counsel for Environmental Initiatives at the EPA, though she's joining us tonight solely in her own personal capacity as a member of the Engelman-Ackerman family. Marianne has lectured widely and taught graduate law and undergraduate level courses. Her most recent writing focuses on civil rights, enforcement in the environmental justice context, and the role of lawyers in community-based movements for social change. So please join me in welcoming Marianne Lado.
Thanks so much. And I bring deep appreciation on behalf of the Engelman family, which created this lecture series in honor of my grandparents. Thank you to the Mark School, Dean Sherry Ryan, the Ackerman chair, and the Ackerman lecturer tonight. I'm looking forward to his remarks on just transition and democratic planning this evening. My deep appreciation also to all of you in the room and online tonight. I wish I could be there in person. And to all of you who are enduring more time on Zoom or streaming services to join us, a big thanks also to Diana Lazoff, who makes all of this happen. Finally, I want to recognize the vision of my parents, Erwin and Rosalind Engelman, who made the Ackerman lecture series possible, and my sister, Madeline Cohen. They will all be on Zoom tonight. The gift was intended to continue and deepen the dialogue and the conversation and thought and research on equality and justice in the Mark School, which is so important, not only for the community within the Mark School, but as an incubator for deep thought in our city and our nation. The series was named after my grandparents, Nathan and Lily Ackerman, and it's fitting we meet today, December 6th, which is the anniversary of my grandfather's death. My grandparents had a hard life as immigrants to this country from Russia and Poland. Though they felt the US was a land of opportunity for their families, for their children, and for us, their children's children, they did not have it easy. My grandmother went to work 2 weeks after arriving in this country as a teenager. She was paid $9 a week, not a day, using a sewing machine in a sweatshop on Broadway here in New York, or there in New York. I'm actually in DC right now. There was what she called a forelady who would watch her every movement and the movement of the other folks at the girls at the sewing machine, and watched over them while they worked, every minute, how long they went to the bathroom, and everything they did. For his part, my grandfather longed for fresh air. He had been born in Poland on a farm, and the ability to see the night stars and have a decent life. Of course, the exploitation of low-wage workers and poor working conditions continue today in New York, across the country, and across the globe. The topic tonight, just transition, marries the ideas of fairness to workers and communities, that yearning for fresh air, with the need for sustainability, clean air, clean water, and a safe place to live. Tonight's topic is trenchant and timely, with U.S. representatives now meeting with delegates from around the world to discuss steps to address climate change at COP28. We have the opportunity not only to move away from reliance on fossil fuels, but as we do so, to be intentional about how we address these problems, how we create a more equitable economy, how to shape opportunities, how to build the goals of equity and justice into planning on the front end, so that the process for achieving fairness, for achieving a clean, healthy, and sustainable economy will be fair to workers and community residents. The principles of just transition provide hope, not only for us, not only for a path to address climate change, but also to reshape our economic future. On this anniversary of my grandfather's death, and while COP28 is in session, I can think of few topics more timely and more relevant to issues of equality and justice than the just transition to a healthy economy, clean environment, and sustainable future for our children. In that spirit, I look forward to tonight's lecture, and again, many thanks. I turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for I'm looking at you here and here. Thank you for your moving words. We are so lucky to have you and your family involved in the Marx School, so many thanks to you. Now I'm going to introduce Professor Ana de Sousa, who's the Ackerman Chair. She's a development economist who studies issues related to food security and nutrition, food price shocks, conflict, instability, governance, and international trade. Before joining Baruch, she worked as a research economist at the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She also worked as an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She worked as a consultant for the World Bank and a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal. Dr. Sousa received a BS in Finance and Economics from the Stern School of Business at NYU and an MS and PhD in Economics from UCLA. Thank you so much, Anna, for the work you're doing as Ackerman Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Just going to open this up before I introduce our speaker, so we are all set. And let me forget on Zoom how I can make this disappear. Remove? No, we don't want to remove her. Remove the pin. Okay, almost. You'd think after so many years of online teaching, but I'm just going to put Marianne down there. Okay, welcome everyone. Oh, Marianne, I don't think, okay, give me one moment. It's a little tech thing, so just time out for 1 second. So Marianne's on Zoom, but she can also stream, right? So I don't have to share on Zoom. Marianne, is that okay? Are you going to stream, or shall I share screen on Zoom? I just want to make sure you can see it. So I think I'll share screen on Zoom. That should work. I hope that you're, okay. All right, give us one more moment, folks. Hide floating thing. Okay, we're almost there. Whew. Welcome, everyone, again. Just wanted to make sure we're all set up for Femi. So again, thank each and every one of you for being here. I'm really excited and happy about the turnout. Marianne actually said a lot of what I was planning to say just as an intro. So there we have it from an expert, although not in her expert opinion, in her personal. We understand, Marianne, that you're here as a private citizen. And so I'll just start by welcoming our speaker tonight and saying that I'm so excited about this discussion, and I'm really excited about the Q&A, so please keep that in mind. Olúfẹ Táíwò is an associate professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. He received his PhD in philosophy at UCLA, great alma mater for those of us who are in this room here. He is published in academic journals ranging from Public Affairs Quarterly, One Earth, Philosophical Papers, and the American Philosophical Association newsletter, Philosophy and the Black Experience. Táíwò's theoretical work draws liberally from the Black radical tradition, anti-colonial thought, German transcendental philosophy, contemporary philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and histories of activism and activist thinkers. His public philosophy, including articles exploring intersections of climate justice and colonialism, has been featured in The New Yorker, The Nation, Boston Review, Dissent, The Appeal, Slate, Al Jazeera, The New Republic, Eon, and Foreign Policy. Femi, I'm so really happy to hear what you have to share with us on just transitions. I hope that in the spirit of the holidays and the new year coming, you will bring us some hope to what is a very challenging, I know that's a hard ask, okay, but we are really hoping to learn from you, and please come take the stage. Thank you.
All right. I will see what I can do about the hope thing. Is there? Oh, here we go. Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, for being here. I'm really honored to get to be part of such an important lecture series. Special thanks to the Ackerman family. Special thanks to Diana and Sherry and Anna for putting all this together. I am going to talk about just transition, as promised, but I'm mainly going to talk about planning, because my experience has been that the conversation around climate justice and the conversation about just transition has often focused on who will foot bills, which is obviously very important for a lot of political reasons. But I think there's some interesting stuff happening amongst researchers who are looking at different decision-making aspects of the world that we could change and indeed the world we could build. And so I'm going to do my best to talk about all of that and keep time. So, just transition, start off with that. Tommy Mazzocchi, who's a leader with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, is often credited with coming up with this term, just transition, and he was one of the nuclear workers who was opposed to the nuclear industry, right? And there's obviously a bit of a tension there, right? The workers of this union made their living from this industry, but nevertheless had serious reservations about the environmental ramifications of that industry. And so on the one hand, they wanted to phase out the industry. On the other hand, the workers who were part of this union depended on it for their livelihood and weren't at fault for whatever was wrong with the industry. So society owed it to them, he and his comrades thought, to give them help transitioning out of this industry. As part of the social cost of moving from an extractive industry to something better than that. And so what they came up with has been described as a superfund for workers, superfund referring to, as many of you know, federal terms for cleanup of hazardous waste, the funds that are set aside for that. Instead of cleaning up the actual toxins, you could clean up the kind of social costs of having to transition out of an extractive industry to another form of economic activity. And as time went on, people used this term more expansively to refer to environmentally extractive industries beyond the nuclear industry. That's where this term just transition comes from. And broadly, the lessons are the same, or at the very least heavily overlapping. We have a problem, a systemic problem. The way that we meet our needs is extractive. The way that we meet our needs involves high levels of carbon emissions. The way that we meet our needs is destroying the planet. Maybe we shouldn't do that. So if we were going to do something else, we would need to fix some of those problems, and we would need to fix qualitatively distinct sets of problems. So amongst the problems, of course, are the problems we hear a lot about, emissions, and emissions causing vehicles, and emissions causing energy sources. But we would also need, if we wanted to have a just transition, the sorts of social changes that add the justice part, right? So who gets access to energy? Who is rendered vulnerable in the case of climate disasters? What are the levels of inequality that are on the product end of the way that we produce energy and the way that that energy is distributed? And who can live where on the basis of the destruction that we've made to our ecology? I won't belabor this point in the interest of time, but I do just want to highlight that these are qualitatively distinct, different problems, and a glaring example of this is the tension between emissions and energy access. Lots of policy-minded folks, lots of activists in the global north are understandably and rightfully up in arms about fossil fuels. We should want phase-outs. But if we want the justice part, we also need to take into account on a practical level that right now, natural gas is how lots of people get heat. Right now, oil and petroleum products is how a lot of people fuel their cars, particularly in the global south. And simply phasing out coal, simply phasing out gas, without building the alternative energy infrastructure, and without facilitating the capital flows across the world's borders from the rich parts of the world to the poor parts of the world, that would facilitate energy access being extended to more people, would be at cross purposes with the goal of climate justice. So we should demand fossil fuel phase out, but that should come alongside a broad push for alternative energy and the funding to adopt alternative energy in many parts of the world. So broadly, my political perspective is based around thinking about these sorts of problems. Where is capital? Where is energy infrastructure? Where are there grids that function? Once you have answered those questions on different scales, you have largely answered, or at least gone some meaningful distance to answering the justice questions. I think of politics as broadly being decided by these questions of how important resources like money, but also like security of various kinds, like political power, are distributed. And I think thinking about how to redistribute those in a very practical mindset is the task of climate justice. And hopefully a few slides from now, it'll be clearer what sort of thing I have in mind with this and why this focus might matter. So getting started with that, we could look at the distribution of cash money. The climate conversation, for the most part, takes place entirely in the top decile or so of human beings, maybe the top 2 deciles. Right? So if you are towards the bottom end, you make the equivalent of 79 cents per day. And if you're in the top end, you make maybe something like 50K a year. And these huge disparities would already get you some distance to telling the story of the climate justice problem. Right? The resources, such as they are, and to the extent that we can measure access to them by personal wealth or household level wealth, are very inequitably distributed. And if we distributed wealth differently, maybe that would, in and of itself, provide some of the things we're looking for out of a just transition. Maybe that would get us some distance from this unjust system to a more just system. But I think there are some reasons for a broader perspective, and in some of the work that I've done with colleagues, we take a look at some reasons you might have for a broader perspective on what actually needs to be redistributed for climate justice or justice in general. So you see a graph on the left that essentially says that the distribution of various indicators of climate vulnerability, life expectancy, maternal mortality, the basic adequacy of the diet and the foods that people have access to are very differently distributed across the world, and the parts of the world that colonize the other parts have much better scores on these measures. They have higher life expectancy, they have higher maternal mortality, all the things that Adger, Brooks, and Kelly researchers that we learned from used to compute a climate vulnerability index. So if you put together all the things that demonstrably show which people die, which people are disproportionately displaced, which people get their incomes ruined by climate impacts, you get something that, you get a set of indicators that you see on the screen there. Sitting next to that reality that we use to compare countries to other countries is a kind of reality that we could also see at a different scale if we were, say, comparing neighborhoods to other neighborhoods. So a landmark set of studies that happened in the 1980s, starting with Congress's General Accounting Office and continuing with an outside entity, the United Church of Christ, found that 3 out of 5 Black and Latino Americans live near a toxic waste site, not because there's any, obviously, direct connection between being part of those demographics and toxic waste, but because the people making the decisions about where to put the toxic waste weren't doing so in a random fashion. They were doing so in ways that tracked political power and wealth. This has recently, by researchers, been given some, at least one plausible causal story. So Thompson, Espin, and Samuels-Jones talk about green crime havens. So looking specifically at the vector of illegal dumping of toxic waste and other kinds of hazardous materials, they find the same kinds of correlations that these earlier studies found, and they reason that the reason why green crimes happen where they happen is because they happen to and around politically disempowered people, which travels with race and class in the ways that I think we would all expect. So here's just another graph saying the thing I said already. Pollution, unequally distributed. Climate change vulnerability, unequally distributed. And it's not an accident. There are various kind of causal mechanisms that we could point out. I think there are a variety of overlapping explanations. But the broad thing that I'm committed to is that across scales of countries or across scales of neighborhoods, generally the politically empowered and the politically disempowered not only live in different worlds of wealth, not only live in different worlds of social privilege and stature, but also live in different environmental worlds. And this would appear to be demonstrably the case given this analysis and the analysis on the preceding slides. So the production and distribution of pollution tends to track social hierarchies fairly neatly. So, why the differentials in environmental vulnerability and climate vulnerability as a subset within that? Distribution of wealth, certainly on the list, but I would say distribution of social advantages more broadly, hierarchical privileges of race and caste, which have something to do with wealth but are not reducible to wealth. These are things that explain who, what, and where is vulnerable to climate impacts. And to just put some flesh on the bones of this, what energy security means in the advanced part of the world, I guess we could say, the industrialized part of the world. I don't know what euphemisms we're going with these days, which pick your favorite. But where the richer people live, by comparison, the worst performing countries in the EU have supply shortages that average out to about a third of a day across the scale of the year. So in any given year, Latvians will go to sleep and wake up and have lost power overnight, and then life will go back to normal. And you could compare that to the reliability of the infrastructure in, say, South Africa, where daily, weekly, incessant load shedding interrupts energy availability to people. And by no means does this affect everyone who lives in South Africa to the same extent. People who are wealthy can have backup generators and do, and they can keep their personal appliances running, they can keep the Wi-Fi on, and those track advantages of race and class in the ways that you would expect. But the unavailability of the grid is not a neighborhood or household level phenomenon. The fact that your traffic lights don't work in your neighborhood is not a household level phenomenon. The fact that the hospital where you live might lose power is not a household level phenomenon. It is a national level phenomenon. And at the national level, the South African energy system is an apartheid era institution that was built for the express purposes of fueling mining extraction, primarily for the diamond and gold industries, and only late in South Africa's history was expanded to do anything like serve the population of the country, and which part of the country you will never guess. Same point applies. The social cleavages, the social hierarchies help explain which countries have which levels of energy infrastructure and vulnerability to energy problems, as well as helping to explain which people within these countries have energy infrastructure, or, as the case may be, the ability to survive a malformed energy infrastructure, which will, in all cases, be the rich and well-positioned. So this thing that I said earlier hopefully makes a little bit more sense. You know, if we want a just transition, if we want climate justice, it is not simply about lowering the amount of emissions globally, but we have to actually change these basic distributions of wealth, power, and access to socially governed security. Okay, so we need to make the world different. How so? I have a few ideas. I'm not going to get through all of them, but I'm going to put them all up just in case for Q&A purposes anyone wants to talk about any of the ones that I didn't get to. But I do like cash, so I'm going to talk about that first and foremost. And before I say anything complicated, I think the uncomplicated answer of just giving people money is great. And, you know, it's really not broken. People like it. You know, if you give people money, they can spend it on an individual basis. They can also pool it. You know, it's a great idea. If you did one thing, there'd be a good case for it being that, the unconditional cash transfer. But when we get into policy land and we ask more complicated questions, there are some interesting technical things that come up that I do think are worth talking about. One of which is cash from whom? So generally, the conversation, particularly at COP and at the sort of institutions of academia and journalism that people who go to COP might read, a major point of discussion is which countries should kick in for climate transitional funding of various kinds. Who should be on the hook for climate mitigation, decarbonizing our existing energy system? Who should be on the hook for loss and damage, responding to hurricanes and earthquakes and flooding that has been exacerbated by the climate crisis? And generally, people have argued that wealthy countries, the industrialized countries, the kind of countries that only lose 8 hours of power a day, should be on the hook for paying some of these needed climate changes on a planetary scale. And they have pledged a combined total of about $700 million, which, I don't know, sounds like a lot of money to you and me, but maybe, probably not to the policy analysts in the room, of which there are many, but on the scale of the level of wealth that these countries have, that is essentially a happy meal and a handshake. I think the best comparison is just to the scale of the actual economic losses that countries are incurring because of the climate disasters we're already seeing, much less the ones that we'll see in 10, 20, 30 years that we ought to be preparing for. And it is less than 0.25% of the existing level of climate damage. The United States has pledged less than 20 million, which puts it at 1/5 of the pledge of the United Arab Emirates, which, yeah, that's happening. Yeah, so nobody's really taking this seriously at the nation state level, and they probably should. One way that they could, especially for the countries that are a little stingier about their budgets, is a vehicle that the International Monetary Fund has created. They're called special drawing rights. They're essentially IMF bucks that states can draw on in place of foreign exchange reserves. So they can use these IMF coupons to buy things like the resources to make hospitals and roads and to make those things resilient against possible energy disruption. And there are some people calling for this, maybe most importantly the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley. The thing that's important to know about this for the moment is that right now, everybody gets these coupons already, right? All the countries of the world get some measure of these coupons, but they are distributed according to IMF quotas. Essentially, the richer you are, the more coupons you get, right? Which is backwards, right? It should be that the countries that need it the most, which are disproportionately less wealthy, get the most of them, but it's the other way around. And utilization rates are below 20% in the rich countries like the United States. So, you know, we don't even use the coupons. We just don't want anybody else to have them, I guess. So this is one weird trick to solve the just transition that the IMF could try out, and I think would be worth it. But if we left the nation-state framework for just a second, there's, also the fact that corporations, some of which are state-owned, as you'll see on the left here, the top firms on this graph are Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, National Iranian Coal, Oil Corporation, Coal India, and only at number 5 is the United States' own ExxonMobil. And this is a chart produced by some people by some researchers who are estimating what private sector reparations might look like. So if we charge reparations to corporations according to their share of global emissions, and maybe adjusted it to take into, to put the corporations that are based in the global north a little bit higher on the list and the ones based in the global south a bit lower, you could get a list like this saying not just which corporations should have to pay reparations for climate damage, but actually a first pass estimate of how much. And it's something like 5,444 billion, which I will remind you is a much larger number than the Happy Meal and handshake that the nation states of the world have promised us. But of course, neither the nation states nor ExxonMobil have actually shelled out anything. But if you wanted to do some math and figure out how much you could ask for, then these people, Grasso and Heed, the researchers who produced this graph, they've got you covered. But as promised, I don't want to just talk about the dollars, because the problem behind the dollars is the one that I just raised jokingly on the last slide, which is that whatever dollar amounts we come up with that the US or ExxonMobil or Saudi Aramco should be on the hook for, so long as they get to decide whether or not they're going to pay, I think we can all guess how things are going to go, right? So the root problem is not just how the money is distributed, with the Saudi Aramcos and ExxonMobils of the world hoarding much of the world's wealth, but it's also with the political processes, the decision-making processes that help decide who's going to get to control wealth, and who's going to get to decide to drill where, and who's going to get to receive public investment. And I think if we look at that problem directly, there's another set of things that we might be interested in, another set of political changes that we might be interested in, that if we made some progress on, might help us get the other stuff, right? So if we change who decides what the tax rates are, what the forms of energy provision are, where new energy transmission lines get built, and who gets access to energy. If we changed who was at the decision-making table and how that table made its decisions, maybe we'd get a little bit further in redistributing wealth and energy and all the other stuff that we're interested in. So what are the aspects of just transition that people are talking about that have to do with redistributing decision-making power? We might try to reform those supranational institutions like the International Monetary Fund that's giving the rich countries all of the coupons, right? So the transnational political power section might catch our eye if we were interested in that. We might be interested in how the IMF makes decisions in the first place, or how the World Bank makes decisions in the first place, and why the leaders of these were almost invariably either from the US or from Europe for the last few decades. We might want another kind of supranational institution entirely. We might think the IMF is too far gone, WTO is too far gone. We just need some other thing whose job it is to make the kinds of climate decisions across borders that are going to be compatible with us staying on this planet. There have been some researchers that have argued for that. Maybe we need a global climate stabilization fund to do that work and stop expecting the IMF and World Bank to do it. Maybe at the regional level, we need to build different kinds of economies and different kinds of literal environments. We need to literally restore ecosystems that have been destroyed or that are undergoing destruction. We need to restore rainforests. We need to restore mangroves in different parts of the world, and there are a number of researchers who have thought about those things. Those are all very worthy political projects that there's much to say about. For now, I will just say that I hope people are interested in them and check them out. But I want to talk about at least a couple of these before I shut up, and I'll start with energy democracy. So what's energy democracy? Well, if you like democracy, you'll love energy democracy. Right? What if we didn't just get to vote every few years for, you know, somebody to lie to us and then take money from corporations to do what they want? You know, what if we got to make decisions more directly about specific sectors of our life? One sector that we might think is particularly historically important, given the whole planet being on fire thing, is energy, right? Because maybe a more direct democratic decision-making process would produce better outcomes, maybe not perfect outcomes, but at least maybe better outcomes than the current shareholder-focused kinds of decision-making that we get from corporations or the national elite, political elite controlled versions of them that we get with state-owned oil corporations. Maybe if we had smaller scale community level ownership of power, we would avoid the pitfalls of those other ways of organizing power. And there are some people arguing for this. Full disclosure, I am one of them. And, you know, talk to us. We have lots of ideas. But just appreciating energy democracy and the idea that people should get to make decisions about what their energy systems are like as a principle doesn't tell us in and of itself what a democratic energy system would or should be like. And the devil may well be in the details. So we could imagine an energy system that was democratic but centralized. So a national level grid that was controlled maybe by some kind of directly elected board or a network of such boards. So the state of Nebraska has a system that is much like this. Right? All the energy producing entities in the state are publicly owned, but there's a couple of control boards and a number of regional nodes of that network. But we could have a centralized, centrally planned kind of democratic energy system. We could have a decentralized democratic energy system. So any neighborhood that wants to get together might collectively make some local decisions about how to provide energy in that town or on that block or in that region. And that would leave radically open questions about how you might want to connect those at different scales, or whether you wanted to connect those at different scales. Or we could let the nerds do it. So on the right side, you see, in the right top hand corner, you see a technocratic energy centralism, right? Which is something like the energy system in the state-owned case, where policy experts make decisions about how and where to make new energy transmission lines, what kinds of energy to utilize, and do so with minimal or non-existent consultation of the people receiving that energy. And at the bottom right-hand corner, you have libertarian energy decentralism, which is just when poor people don't get energy and rich people do, which is maybe not the fairest way to describe libertarians, but Sorry. Okay, great. So, could we actually do this? Some researchers who are responding to a couple of pilot projects in South African townships reflected on that experience and reported more or less a mixed bag. Right? On the one hand, there are good things about putting people in the driver's seat. You get a lot of buy-in to potentially new and novel alternative energy. If people had never used solar before and you give them meaningful choice over how and when to implement it, people are going to take that option more seriously. But nevertheless, you know, there are questions about how electricity works and what scale of transmission is feasible and what scale of production is feasible that really just do take technocratic knowledge, and it's difficult to eliminate the policy expert from some kind of position of power within these networks. So it's difficult to root out the inequality that may be inherent to such kinds of approaches. I'm not going to say too much about these cases, but I do want to just mention a couple of ways that public ownership could go. And both of these ways I think of as suboptimal, but for very different reasons. So suboptimal case number one is Norway. People are constantly raving about how dope it is to live in Norway. They've got great social services. They have education and paid leave and a very progressive slate of pro-family social policies. But it is funded by one of the largest pools of investment capital in the world, which derives a lot of its returns from its oil and gas industry. And as we saw a few slides ago, many of the corporations that are most responsible for global emissions, or at least are responsible for the production associated with those emissions, are state-owned companies. The state-owned company of India, of Iran, of Saudi Arabia. And so public ownership in the sense of state ownership doesn't seem to be a get out of emissions free card. Even, friendly social service promoting countries like Norway don't seem to be able to wean themselves off fossil fuels or have any interest in doing so. And then there's just, of course, rampant theft, which is another thing that might happen in a state-owned industry. You might get some resource curse type stuff going on, and the people who are well politically positioned might just make off with lots and lots of cash, maybe with some help from Swiss bankers, as the case was in Angola. Yeah. But another path might learn from this place called New York City. Another thing we could try is putting smaller public institutions, not the size of a country necessarily, but maybe the size of a state or a province, in charge of energy production, and given an explicit legislative mandate to do so in an alternative energy and justice promoting way. In the case of New York, mandating by way of the Build Public Renewables Act for the state to produce renewable energy production rather than rely on private industry. This legislation, which passed recently, aims to produce 70% of electricity from renewables, which had already been the state's target, but now mandates the state to plan and operate renewable energies in service of those goals. So this is an approach that doesn't just nationalize or doesn't just rely on having public power authority, but exercising authority over that authority to do so in to produce renewable energy and to produce renewable energy in a justice promoting way. One of the key provisions of the Build Public Renewables Act is that union labor has to be a part of the renewable energy production. So worker justice, the exact kind of thing that motivated the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, is a present, at least at the level of principle, in this kind of legislation. It's the sort of thing you might think of. Okay, one last point. Another form of decision-making power you might think of redistributing would be, how is it that public funds in general, including but beyond energy, get decided about? Here there's a research area and an area of practice. There's lots and lots of actual versions of this, including right here in New York City, something called participatory budgeting. This was piloted in Porto Alegre, Brazil, shortly after the end of the military dictatorship there by the Brazilian Workers' Party. The idea is to essentially, in something like a town hall format, get people together and just decide on spending priorities. What do we want to do with city cash? Depending on how the program is designed, it can be effective in franchising marginalized community members. The participatory budgeting pilots that were done in Kerala in India made explicit attempts to statistically overrepresent people from marginalized castes in order to check back against caste-based discrimination. This is the kind of design approach that could work elsewhere. And generally you find in cases like in India, in Mozambique, in Kenya, that participatory budgeting processes can increase alignment of government spending with public priorities because the public would simply be setting the priorities in the best case. It's not a magic format. Lots of countries and cities, unfortunately including New York City, only devote token amounts of money to participatory budgeting programs. I guess the NYPD global surveillance program won't pay for itself, but the political ecology beyond it matters. Right? How is it that people think about democracy? How is it that people think about fairness? And what level of importance is put on participatory budgeting compared with other ways of providing cash for government services? In places where it's a low priority, I don't expect it to move the needle very much on climate. But in places where it is, it's just might. So there's been some research on the role of participatory budgeting in climate action specifically. And the successful participatory budgeting programs tend to be fairly well resourced. And they also tend to have well-paid staff whose job it is to make sure people can actually get together and make decisions together. Run the town hall and be accountable to each other for the decisions that they make. And genuinely have the power to decide what spending priorities for the city or town or village or county are going to be. When the elected officials are running the show from the background, you don't see very different kinds of climate interventions, but when people get to decide what the flooding risks really are and where they want to spend money on climate mitigation, then that's what they do. So I'm going to end with just floating a possibility. There's a lot of policy-minded people in the room, so I figured I would just ask you what you think about this. Why not just force polluters to fund participatory budgeting programs? Imagine, leave aside for a second how we would force them, but if we got them to spend money at all, would this be a good thing to get them to spend money on? That's the question I'm putting before you. There's some pros and cons to that approach. That would redistribute wealth. It would redistribute political decision-making power in a fairly direct way. Not only would you be giving up money, but you wouldn't be giving up money to a, NGO-run slush fund. You would be giving money to a participatory process that people in the community get to participate in and decide what it means for that community. Because it would involve people in that community, it would be likelier to meaningfully involve the knowledge that they have about what people care about and what the actual problems are in that community, which is often missing from a lot of top-down interventions. And because it would fund people directly, you might be able to avoid the Angola problem, right? You might be able to avoid a few well-positioned people running off with everybody's money because you give people the money in a somewhat direct fashion. I don't think this is necessarily a foolproof idea. There might be good reasons to centralize climate efforts. We might want big, huge solar farms, and maybe if we give money to 1,000 different small participatory budgeting programs, we're not going to get that kind of intervention because the scale is too diffuse. Some states might take it the wrong way. If you are a political official in a country and a rich country says we can't trust your government and we're going to bypass you and give money directly to the people, you might have some questions about why they're doing that. And giving money directly to communities doesn't evade the problem of some people being better positioned than others. Even within neighborhoods, there are people who have more money and less money. There's people who have more social privileges of various kinds, people across the racial hierarchy spectrums. There's all kinds of forms of power, and maybe we're just moving the problem rather than resolving it if we're worried about injustice. Those are the pros and cons. I think it's worth discussing. And I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Femi, for that very interesting and somewhat inspiring talk. I would say there was some hope there. You laid out, for those of us here at the Mark School of Public and International Affairs and other of our colleagues from other schools that do a lot of similar work, we're happy to have lots of ideas laid out. I will just give you a quick joke that I tell my economists, my students sometimes, that you have economists who will come and we'll talk about the first best solution, and then we have political scientists who come in and are like, oh, that's not possible ever. So, we'll go for second or third best. And I guess we have the philosophers that say, imagine a world where we could get these companies to pay that, what would it look like, right? And so there is some hope there in imagining what, maybe as an economist I would say is perhaps unrealistic, but we never know, right? We got to keep pushing. And I think the hope, for me at least, lies in our students. And first of all, thank you, students, for being here. There are several of you in the room. I know some people had to leave to go to class, but it is my real pleasure to invite LaDorian Morris up here, please. LaDorian is pursuing a Master in Public Administration right here at the Mark School of Public and International Affairs. She has a focus on sustainability and environmental justice. She is a BA from Marymount University and has worked in the social service sector with youth. As a housing case manager, she provided resources and advocacy services to unhoused individuals. Ms. Morris has traveled abroad to assist those in need as well, volunteering with a water restoration program and low-income women in Bangalore, India. Ms. Morris is a native New Yorker, raised in Queens. In her free time, she volunteers with local community gardens, roller skates, and creates sustainable jewelry. So please give a warm round of applause to LaDorian. We are going to have our Q&A begin now, but I would like to begin with LaDorian. She and Femi are going to be in conversation for a little while, and then we'll bring it back to audience questions. So please.
Thank you, Professor D'Souza, for having me be part of this discussion today, and thank you, Femi, again for coming today and that great lecture on transitioning and energy democracy. You talked a lot about political power on all levels and the issues that come with that. And the private sector here in the U.S. has a lot of political power. And I want to say, given our profit-driven American society, one might question feasibility of a full energy transition. What do you think are the first steps to addressing some of those issues with political power and transitioning in America?
Yeah, that's, I think, the kind of lurking question behind, everything I was talking about, as Anna pointed out, right? How do we get any of this? But I don't think, 2 years ago, I would have maybe been of exactly the same opinion, like why even talk about any of this stuff, given how strong corporations are? But a few successful strikes later, maybe most notably by the UAW, now I'm, yeah, give it up for them. I mean, now I'm starting to think a little differently. And so are they. The president of the UAW is calling for the organization of the rest of the auto worker sector and calling for workers' unions to align their contracts and make a general strike possible in a few years. And, with a general strike, anything is possible. You hit corporations in the one place they care about, which is their pockets, and all of a sudden mountains start to move. So that's what it comes down to for me. Some kind of leverage. The other lever beyond the kind of bottom-up approach of worker strikes or other kinds of strikes, you can imagine debtor strikes or tenant strikes, something that exerts that kind of leverage from the point of view of the masses of people. I mean, the other thing you can imagine is something like state competition as a lever, right? So if the competition between the United States and China and India and all these other large important economies starts to take on an air of competition around the speed of implementation of alternative energies, which you could argue it already has, at least as far as solar is concerned. I think that the possibilities for having an energy transition become much more likely. Some analysts are already predicting it. And then the question from there is, what is the political shape from a justice perspective of the kind of transition that you get by simply making alternative energy more available, which is necessary for a just transition, but not sufficient for a just transition.
Thank you. So I guess there's still some hope. So I want to start off by talking about, I'm in a course, Race Inequality and Public Policies, and we began a discussion about reparations. And I took that opportunity to talk to my mother, Doris, about her thoughts on the matter. And the reason being is because my mother, she grew up in a small town, Goldsboro, North Carolina, and she grew up during the Jim Crow era. And at age 12, she and 8 other children were selected to be integrated into the school system. And the night before the first day of school, the KKK put a burning cross on them on the night before. And that was pretty much to instill fear and intimidation. And she talks about that time being very difficult for her. And even with everything that she and my family had been through in the past, she had a hard time deciding what the best form of reparations would be to right all the wrongs. And one of the things we did decide was that reparations should be something that can not only benefit her, but also generations after her. Femi, you advocate for considering climate justice as a form of reparations for oppressed communities in the US and globally. which strategies would you prioritize to address climate justice for people like my mom and my family and in our community?
Yeah, that's a sobering question. I think the first thing I would say, the reason why I'm interested in things like participatory budgeting and make all these points about decision-making power is that I actually just think it should be up to your mom, right? You know, and I think at bottom, what I envision being redistributed is self-determination. So are people meaningfully empowered to decide to access wealth in the first place that was stripped from them, but also to decide what they want to do with it? And that's what I find attractive about just giving people checks. But it's also what I find attractive about communal level redistribution of wealth as well. So, you know, giving people in a town, maybe where she grew up, maybe people where folks are now, but giving people the collective space to make those kinds of decisions. And I mean, you know, the hope would be that people would think about it in a multi-generational way, but it would be up to them at the end of the day. Yeah.
Thank you for that response. Yes, I've been seeing a lot of local government, state, and countries doing different things in regards to reparations. And one of the things I haven't seen as much is including the community that are directly affected. And so I think that's one of the best things, like you said, you know, my mother being a part of that decision, a community being a part of that decision, and them deciding what's the best for them and what they think for everyone, and also for generations. That's also the best thing. So thank you for that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. All right. Okay, everyone. As you like, as you wish. Okay, we got a full house today, so we want to make sure everyone's sitting and has seats. Okay. Thank you so much, LaDorian. I'm gonna now sit over here and be your conduit to our speaker. So this is time for audience participation, folks. And as I'm a professor, I'm very happy with waiting for silence. Like just being here sitting silently and waiting for some questions. I don't think I'll have to wait very long. I know many of you were excited to come and see this talk today. So I'd like to open this up to the audience right now. We also have a lot of people streaming online, and they've put in some questions, I hope, that Amanda will share. But for now, the mic is yours. Who would like to ask the first question? Please give me a nod or put your hand up. Great, thank you.
Hi all, my name is Ramon. I'm a MPA alum here at the Mark School, and I have a question. You know, I was listening to your talk, and many times we associate, not that it's not right most of the time, you know, renewals with progressive and collective ownership. But in some countries, and I'm thinking specifically about Ecuador at the moment, in the past it's been different, but it's like the other way around where, you know, non-renewables and oil and all of that is state-owned and they're unionized and all these things. And then the renewables, at the moment, it's mainly from like the private sector that's, you know, non-union and all of that. So just from your perspective, how do you work with that, or what's like a middle ground?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And one of the things that I think I wanted out of the Norway example is, you know, from the other direction to kind of put pressure on this assumption that like there's a inherent connection between alternative energy and progressive politics, right? So Norway being an example of a progressive but oil-friendly place, and there are many places where people in the extractive sectors are unionized and often, you know, have solidarity with environmentalists outside of those organizations. But in any case, there's no essential connection between renewable energy and having any particularly progressive kind of politics. And so I actually see ideally the role of some of these cash transfers that we're pushing for from global north to south to just make it in people's interest to adopt alternative energy. Just pay people to do it, right? Rather than assuming that they're going to inherently, associate solar power with freedom or whatever. Just make it, just subsidize it, right? And the failure of the global north to do that, and not just the global north, but that is a somewhat useful shorthand. But the failure of the powers that be to do that, I think, is part and parcel of the ongoing climate crisis from a political perspective.
Another question from the audience? Yes, please, Samantha.
Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I wanted to focus on your statement where you said you were taking a global view of the world in terms of production and distribution, and then you could add to that extraction and consumption, and also labor. You've brought into that, and also people's safety and health and meeting needs, and that accords with how I view things too. I'm very familiar with that, but I wonder, as a philosopher, whether you've thought about the role of religion and spirituality and all of that, because this is something that I'm starting to think about in a new way after having had this very, materialist political economy background. And I just would like to ask you that.
Inside me, there are two warring versions of myself, where one is like a curmudgeonly materialist. It's like there's only atoms and void and class struggle and there's nothing else. Shut up. And then the second version of me, there's really nothing like that. That grew up in the church and came from my parents' background is a very explicitly religious one. Everybody is explicitly religious in Nigeria, and there's a really peculiarity to the way that certain cultures, U.S., France, political cultures are secular that really doesn't translate to most of the world. And even within the U.S., I don't want to put words in LaDorian's mouth, but but when you were talking, I just thought about what a spiritual connection it feels like to me when I think about my kids or my friends' kids and their kids and their kids, right? The extent to when I talk about wanting to leave the world a certain way so that they have access to things. I'm not making a statistical prediction about a bunch of trends. I feel a connection to them that I would characterize as spiritual, and I feel responsibility to them that I would characterize as spiritual. And so I think at least at the level of, motivation amongst the people who have taken up these kinds of intergenerational questions of justice, I think there is, if not a necessary, at least a helpful and useful spiritual dimension of what it is to be committed to something that would unfold over that length of time. I couldn't say beyond that what role spirituality should play, but I would say at least that.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Rolanda Hines. I'm an undergrad student here at Baruch. And I read experts of reconsidering reparations in my philosophy class, but this was after I had a project where I asked, what if violence is a form of reparations? Or like, what if victims decide that violence is a form of reparations? And when you were talking with Ms. Morris, she brought up the example of her mother, and you talked about self-determination. So I was just thinking, like, could reparations mean something else rather than like the capital or like the environmental justice things, and what would that look like for you?
That's a bold question. I love it. Okay. All right, let's talk about it. It can and it has. Right? Like it's not even hypothetical. Just historically, this is what Dessalines meant by reparations, this is what Nat Turner meant, and what will I say? I don't see why they don't get to mean that. I'll put it that way. Given what they were responding to, I don't see why they don't get to mean that. I don't see why the Mau Mau doesn't get to mean that. But is that, my question would be, is that what's going to secure a future for your children? And, if you're fighting in the Union Army, maybe it is, right? But that's a strategic question. It's not a question at the level of principle, right? But what is it going to take to build a world where your children are free? And that means something different in 1798 than it means in 2023, depending on where in the world you're at.
These are our Baruch undergrads. Okay, let's take a moment and just check if there's anyone. Hello, everyone online. We really appreciate you watching this lecture. Are there any questions from our online? Yeah, great. Thank you, Amanda. Go ahead.
How do energy grids fit into the concept of energy democracy, especially since grids typically cross state and regional boundaries?
Uneasily, but they do fit. So I think energy grids, particularly grids that cross state lines, some of which cross borders, in the best case could be, the literal physical infrastructure for something like energy solidarity, right? So we make a grid that connects, through transmission lines, this country with this country, and when there's excess demand, there's a place to dump the energy. When there's not enough energy over here and these people have a surplus, we can share. So these are ways that we can buffer the various problems that there are to making sure that everyone has energy access. So that's certainly a way that energy grids could fit into a just transition. But they could also be used more exploitatively, right? Maybe over there where the poor people are, that's where all the sun is. And over here, we're going to build transmission lines to make sure that the energy that is producible over there becomes our guarantee for energy security, and we don't look out for the people over there. And if there were any such plans in Morocco or so, then maybe there would be some hard questions to ask about what a just version of the program might look like. But I don't think there is a guaranteed answer in terms of just what a grid is that's going to say whether or not it fits into a just transition or a just provision of energy, or an unjust one. It's all in the details of
who is given access to energy, at what rates, and who is given access to making decisions over those things.
Right. Yes. Ready to jump in, but I'm going to wait 'cause as moderator. I will wait. Are there any other? Yes. Dean Ryan.
See if I have any voice. Thank you so much. A lot of your talk about grids reminds me of transportation planning, and my background is transportation planning. We deal with networks, and you might want to look at the transportation literature because there are frameworks for how that happens at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, and maybe energy could follow some. It sounds, I don't know a lot about energy, the kind of energy you're talking about, but maybe there's something there. But I do and have done quite a bit of local transportation planning. So we're going into communities, and what I've done and kind of devoted my career to is trying to get people out of their cars, trying to encourage and help local governments to build bicycle and walking networks so that people can choose to not drive. But we go into communities all the time, and people want to drive. They want to engage in the behavior that we know is not good for the globe. And it's really difficult. It's really difficult. And so when you talked about the local budgetary, local participatory budgeting process, I was starting to think about, well, what if you go into communities and set up a process and people are deciding to spend money in ways that are polluting and destructive? And that's so difficult, and you know, I've faced that for sure in communities. So just thought I would get your ideas on that. Some of those.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll definitely have to take a look at the transportation literature because, yeah, now that you're saying it, it makes total sense, right? You know, different rail systems connecting to different metro systems. It's a similar set of problems of scale and how, you know, one set of decisions in this city connect with this other. So yeah, that's definitely worth a look. And I hear what you're saying on, you know, the potential pitfall with participatory budgeting. You know, people do in fact have, you know, I think it comes back to, you know, Ramon's question, you know, like people do have commitments other than the ones we might expect. People do like driving. You know, I grew up in southwestern Ohio. You know, we drive from the bedroom to the bathroom to brush our teeth in the morning. Like, you know, I have no presumption that people are just gonna all of a sudden become Sierra Club members just because a participatory budgeting program opens up in their district. But I think the case for participatory budgeting is at least helped along if we're less thinking in an absolute sense, will people make the range of decisions that are optimal or best from a climate perspective? And if we instead just adopt a comparative perspective, will the decisions people make in their communities be more or less destructive than the decisions shareholders would make in their communities? Because that's actually the choice in front of us. And I do think, one, in the short term, that most places will, you know, pollute their neighbors less than BlackRock would. You know, even if they don't do the thing that I would hope that they would do. But I also think that over time, as people see the ramifications of the choices they make, you know, I would hope that that would lead people in the direction of doing things that are, you know, over time improving in terms of their effects on the neighborhood, like more health promoting, more justice promoting. And I think if you're a supporter of democracy, if that's a value that you have, it's not just a moral value. I do think at bottom, you are making a bet that people can be trusted with power, right? That is a core part of the commitment to democracy, that we are not better off with the authoritarians or the technocratic nerds deciding for the rest of us, that, you know, all of us, each of us, can collectively be trusted with deciding what we want our lives to be like. And I think that's a bullet we should just bite.
I was thinking about what you said earlier, and then you just repeated it, the trust that you put in humans, in people. And I always get excited reading your work, especially because as a philosopher, you're really engaging the way capitalism has really killed and is killing the planet. And I wonder what you think about ITMOs and the, there's this big debate that's happening right now at the COP where the Global South and rainforest countries, for instance, are trying to trade sovereign, what do you call them? I'm sorry, I'm sort of fangirling right now. Sovereign carbon credits. And then, of course, the Global North is saying, oh, we can't trust them to measure the carbon sinks that they are producing that are sustaining the planet at the moment. And I wonder how you kind of can help someone like me and students reconcile this sort of self-determination, this move that's coming out of really tiny, broke countries that are doing incredibly hugely impactful solutions to the injustices and the climate emergency, et cetera. And then the sidebar is, like, I'm just watching Guyana get, like, is anybody gonna stand up to Venezuela in this? But that's a different question. But anyway, ITMOs, please, thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That's really interesting. The first thing that it occurs to me to say about Global North spectators and Global North corporations and political actors saying that they can't trust the carbon sequestration numbers from the Global South. This is just adorable. There's the worst kept secret in climate politics is that, carbon offsets and the whole math around them are just nakedly fraudulent. I can't even keep track of how many exposés I've read that just, they give different numbers. Sometimes it's 97% of them are abject bullshit. Sometimes it's 98.3. But, the idea that, there's some verified, accepted, and well-run, well-managed way of making sure that there's genuine additionality from a climate perspective to the whole milieu of things that people are selling under the heading of carbon offsetting and all that is just a lie from the devil. Okay, but all that aside, I think the bigger thing is the thing you actually focused on, right? Which is land, right? And land being essentially auctioned off to people that have various greenwashing reasons for acquiring it. I think the other reason that I'm pushing and trying to, joining the many people trying to have conversations about debt cancellation and SDRs and cash transfers is because it seems to me that, like, this is the thing that countries are doing in the absence of serious international efforts on those things, right? Like, they have to come up with revenue somehow, and a bunch of costs from ecological destruction are being dumped on them, and nothing in the way of real financing or real policy support is coming along with that. And it makes sense that, well, let me not, but yeah, so the hope would be that there's a kind of indirect solution to the problem that comes by way of movement on some of these better ways of financing. I know they're talking about debt for climate swaps at COP28, and God knows what the swaps will be, but that's still better. It's still better for converting your land to essentially recolonizing countries acre by acre, which is the alternative.
Alternatives and counterfactuals, other things that economists love. So on that note, I will say thank you very much to everyone. Thank you so much, Shannon. So many microphones. Again, as I mentioned, I'm an economist, so I value your time and mine. And so it is 7:30. I'm going to stop here and say just a couple of words, because I think a lot has been said tonight, and I really appreciated the Q&A and the presentation. So first, I want to thank our guest speaker. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate you being here in person and sharing your ideas and welcoming the engagement with others around these extremely important topics. I thank all of our guests who are here in person, Baruch faculty, Baruch students, staff, friends, and some of our alum in the room. Thank you so much for being here. We thank all of you for being here online. In particular, we thank the Engelman family. I want to say particular thank you so much for what you have endowed our school with. This is a real special opportunity to highlight issues of inequality and social justice, and this is one that is so timely, as Marianne you described already. So I just want to thank the family again, and finally I want to thank all of the staff here, in particular Diana Lazov, who put this together with a lot of help from others in the room who I cannot see, but Angelina and Amanda, and yes, many different people here, but also the people here at Baruch, still over here behind the camera, and everyone who's put this room together and will be cleaning it up after we leave. So they're not here right now, but I'm thanking them as well, and we appreciate your interest in this topic. We hope that you will share this lecture and this discussion with your students and family and friends, because honestly, I even told my parents about this. I was like, this is really important, and they may not see all the repercussions that are coming in the decades to come. Our kids will see it, and I really hope that this inspires you to learn more about this topic, to engage with it, and look forward to hearing about the Ackerman lecture for the spring. So thank you again very much for being here, and thank you, Femi. Thank you so much.